For the last time, Brenda, step away from the door. My voice cracked, strained not just by the wind that howled like a banshee down Pleasant Meadows Drive, but by the sheer, unadulterated disbelief at what I was witnessing. Outside the squat, concrete bunker that was our community's designated tornado shelter, Brenda Wexler, our esteemed HOA president and reigning monarch of meticulously manicured lawns and precisely placed recycling bins, was in the process of securing the heavy steel door. Not opening it, securing it. With a brand spanking new industrial-grade chain and a padlock that looked like it could have secured Fort Knox. The sky, as I may have mentioned, was a rather alarming shade of bruised plum wrestling with sickly green. Leaves and small branches whipped past us in a frenzy. The roar was getting louder, that low, guttural growl that every Weather Channel talking head insists sounds like a freight train. Right now, I'd have settled for a mild commuter rail. What we were facing felt more like a runaway locomotive filled with angry bees. "I will not be bullied, Mr. Henderson!" Brenda shrieked back, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. Her graying perm whipped around her face like a startled tumbleweed. She wrestled with the chain, her brow furrowed in concentration as if she were disarming a bomb, not actively preventing a dozen of her neighbors from seeking shelter from one. "This is for our safety. We need to maintain order. Last week I distinctly saw..." "Evidence..." She trailed off, her eyes narrowing suspiciously at young Timmy Henderson, who was currently clinging to his mother's leg, his face pale and tear-streaked. Evidence of what? I didn't even want to know. Probably rogue hopscotch chalk or a non-regulation dandelion. "Brenda, there's a Category 4 about to paint our cul-de-sac a lovely shade of destroyed. Nobody cares about your imaginary teenage shelter squatters right now." Mr. Gable, our resident grumpy retiree and the bane of Brenda's bylaw-obsessed existence, bellowed, his voice surprisingly strong for a man who usually complained about the volume of my NPR podcasts. She finally got the chain threaded through the heavy-duty handle and a thick metal loop bolted to the concrete wall. With a triumphant grunt, she snapped the padlock shut. "There," she declared, as pleased as if she'd just solved world hunger rather than created a very real, very immediate death trap. Perfectly secure. Then came the truly sublime moment of cosmic irony. The shelter door also had a standard combination lock, the code of which had been circulated to all residents in the event of, an actual emergency. Brenda, with a flourish, punched in the numbers. The lock gave a little electronic beep, and then nothing. The door didn't budge. The taut chain pulled too tightly across the mechanism had jammed the latch solid. A collective gasp rippled through the small crowd huddled at the entrance. Brenda's face, already pale from the wind and the adrenaline, drained of all color. She fumbled in her pocket for the key to her ridiculously oversized padlock. Her hands were shaking so badly that the tiny brass key slipped from her grasp, bounced off the concrete, and with a sickening little tink, disappeared down the metal grate of the storm drain right next to her feet. Time seemed to slow down. The wind howled, the sky swirled, and we all just stared at that storm drain. It was a perfect, almost cartoonishly absurd tableau of suburban bureaucratic idiocy reaching its horrifying climax. She had tried so hard to control everything, to impose her rigid sense of order on a situation that was inherently chaotic, that she had locked us out of the one place that was supposed to keep us safe. You genuinely couldn't make this stuff up, even if you were mainlining inspiration from a dumpster full of discarded sitcom scripts. That's where I came in. Alex Henderson, mild-mannered graphic designer, connoisseur of questionable late-night internet purchases, and, as it turned out, the proud owner of a metric ton of bright yellow nylon. Let's rewind a bit, shall we? To a more innocent time, roughly 10 hours earlier, when the biggest crisis I was facing was whether the new shade of cedar sunset deck stain would truly clash with Brenda's definition of earthy tones, the emergency evacuation slide, salvaged from a decommissioned Boeing 737, had arrived 3 days prior. It was currently residing in my garage, taking up approximately the same amount of space as a small sedan. The delivery guy, a burly man with a permanent look of weary resignation etched on his face, had grunted something about aviation enthusiasts before practically throwing the enormous olive-drab canvas bag onto my driveway and speeding off. I'd managed to wrestle the behemoth into the garage with the help of a hand truck and a series of increasingly frustrated grunts. Aviation history, the auction listing had proclaimed. A unique opportunity. It had chirped in my whiskey-fueled 2 a.m. haze. Right now, as I contemplated the sheer impracticality of owning an inflatable escape route designed for plummeting aircraft when the nearest airport was a good 45-minute drive away. Unique felt a lot like idiotic. Gus, my contractor, a man whose vocabulary consisted primarily of variations on yep, nope, and the occasional eloquently placed grunt of disapproval, had arrived mid-afternoon to finalize the deck plans. He'd walked into the garage, stopped dead in his tracks, and stared at the bag as if it were an alien life form that had just sprouted from my concrete floor. "What in God's name is that?" he'd finally asked, his usual taciturn demeanor slightly breached by genuine curiosity. "That, Gus," I'd said with a self-deprecating grin, "is an emergency evacuation slide from a Boeing 737. He'd paused, considering this information while thoughtfully chewing on his ever-present toothpick. "You building an airport on that deck, or—" "It was a bargain," I'd insisted, because that's what you say to justify truly inexplicable purchases. Think of it as a very large, very yellow insurance policy I can't cash in. Gus, a man whose priorities revolved around load-bearing walls and proper drainage, had simply shaken his head and moved on to the blueprints spread out on my workbench. He was far more concerned with the rising cost of pressure-treated lumber than my apparent descent into suburban prepper madness. I'd tried to elaborate on the intricacies of government surplus auctions and the surprisingly robust secondary market for decommissioned aircraft parts, but his glazed-over expression suggested I was losing the battle. Later, as Gus was marking out the deck's perimeter in my backyard, Brenda had made her grand entrance. The sky was already starting to look ominous, a sort of bruised watercolor effect creeping in from the west. She had materialized as if summoned by the mere suggestion of construction or any deviation from the pristine uniformity she so diligently policed. Clipboard in hand, she had marched directly onto my property without so much as a "how do you do?" and immediately begun scrutinizing Gus's marker stakes with the intensity of a forensic scientist examining a crime scene. "Mr. Henderson," she'd announced, her voice tight with disapproval. "As I'm sure you recall from the 14-page welcome packet, Section 8, subparagraph D, all new construction, including patios and recreational platforms, requires a minimum setback of 15 feet from the property line. This stake," she'd pointed a perfectly manicured finger at one of Gus's humble wooden markers, "is at 14 feet, 8 inches. "Brenda," I'd sighed, trying to keep the exasperation out of my voice. "First, it's Alex. You've known me for 3 years. Second, Gus was just putting that there to hold the blueprint down. It's not a support piling. The actual deck will be well within the setbacks." She'd tapped her clipboard with an air of unwavering authority. "All preparatory markers must adhere to the final construction parameters. It prevents expectation creep." The ensuing 20 minutes had been a masterclass in Brenda's unique brand of bureaucratic tyranny. She'd interrogated Gus about the load-bearing capacity of the proposed ledger board, expressed concerns about the noise levels during construction hours, despite the fact that Gus operated with the quiet efficiency of a seasoned professional, and even questioned the environmental impact of the Cedar Sunset stain. "Does it comply with the approved earthy tones palette?" she'd demanded, as if my choice of wood finish was a direct threat to the delicate ecological balance of Pleasant Meadows estates. The grand finale had been a pointed observation about the quarter-inch excess in my lawn's vertical growth, a violation punishable, I was sure, by mandatory attendance at her PowerPoint presentation on the proper aeration techniques. Gus, bless his stoic heart, had endured the Inquisition with the impassivity of a granite statue. Once Brenda had finally retreated, presumably to cross-reference my grass height with the community bylaws, he'd turned to me, a rare flicker of something akin to sympathy in his eyes. "She always like that?" he'd rumbled, spitting out his toothpick into the overgrown grass. "Only on days that end in ya," I'd replied wearily. "Last month she tried to fine Mr. Gable because his garden gnome was non-conforming statuary. Apparently, its hat was too pointy." Now, a mere few hours later, the petty squabbles over lawn maintenance and deck setbacks felt laughably insignificant. I was in my home office, ostensibly trying to finalize a logo design for a client who specialized in artisanal dog biscuits, but my attention was glued to the small television screen in the corner of my monitor. The local news meteorologist, a normally unflappable woman named Carol, was looking increasingly frantic. The weather map was a swirling vortex of menacing reds and yellows. The warnings had escalated with terrifying speed. What had started as a tornado watch had morphed into a tornado warning, complete with urgent advisories to seek shelter immediately. Carol's voice, usually calm and reassuring, was now tight with urgency. "This is not a drill," she'd stressed, her eyes wide with concern. "A large, dangerous tornado is on the ground and moving northeast. Residents in Pleasant Meadows Estates are in the direct path." I glanced out my office window. The sky had abandoned any pretense of normalcy. It was an angry, churning mass of that sickly greenish yellow, the color of bad dreams and impending doom. The wind had picked up significantly, rattling the window panes in their frames. The usual suburban soundtrack of lawnmowers and distant traffic had been replaced by an eerie, unnerving silence. It was the kind of quiet that screams louder than any noise. My phone buzzed incessantly with emergency alerts, each one more dire than the last. I grabbed my wallet, keys, and a flashlight, a primal urge to do something kicking in. My gaze drifted towards the closed door of the garage. I pictured the enormous yellow bag lurking within. A brief, dark chuckle escaped my lips. "Well," I thought with a morbid sense of irony, "guess I won't be needing you." Famous last thoughts, probably. Then, the first wail of the town's tornado siren ripped through the air. It was a mournful, chilling sound, a mechanical banshee lamenting our impending fate. It was the universal signal. Things were about to get very, very real. I didn't hesitate. I bolted out of the house and onto the street. The scene was a chaotic ballet of suburbanites scrambling for safety. The Hendersons were ushering their two small, wide-eyed children along, their faces etched with fear. Mr. Gable, surprisingly spry for a man who usually shuffled to his mailbox, was practically sprinting towards the community shelter. The wind buffeted us, strong enough to send unsecured trash cans rolling down the street like runaway tumbleweeds. Leaves and small debris swirled around us in a dizzying vortex. Gus's truck was parked haphazardly at the curb. He'd apparently just finished securing his tools. He leaned out the window, his face grim. "You headin' to the shelter?" he yelled over the wind. I nodded, pulling my jacket tighter against the sudden drop in temperature. "See you there!" he shouted. a rare note of urgency in his voice before he gunned the engine and sped off towards the common green. Everyone was converging on the community tornado shelter, a squat, windowless concrete structure built into a small artificial hill in the center of the neighborhood's meticulously maintained common area. It had been one of the key selling points of the development, a reassuring symbol of safety in a region prone to dramatic weather events. Now it was our only hope. The small crowd of us, maybe 15 or 20 people, huddled at the shelter's heavy steel door. The wind was a physical force now, pushing against us, trying to tear us away. And there, in front of the door, illuminated by the sickly green light filtering through the churning clouds, stood Brenda. She wasn't opening the door. She was wrestling with that ridiculous chain and padlock. "Brenda, what in the hell are you doing?" Mr. Gable's voice, though strained with panic, still held a note of incredulity. "I am securing the secondary locking mechanism," she shrieked back, her voice barely cutting through the wind's roar. She was red-faced, her eyes wide and frantic. "The manufacturer's latch is insufficient. Last week I found evidence of teenagers using the shelter for illicit socializing." "Brenda, for the love of all that is holy, there is a tornado bearing down on us. Now is not the time to implement your neighborhood watch protocols for imaginary delinquents," I yelled, my own voice tight with a mixture of fear and incandescent rage. She finally snapped the padlock shut, the metallic click echoing ominously in the wind. "There," she announced, her face set in a mask of self-righteous satisfaction. "Perfectly secure." And then came the punchline, delivered by the cruel hand of fate. She punched in the code to the regular combination lock. It beeped, but the door remained stubbornly, horrifyingly shut. The chain, stretched taut across the handle, had jammed the entire mechanism. The collective gasp that went through us was primal, a sound of pure, unadulterated fear. Brenda's carefully constructed facade of control crumbled. Her face went as white as the undersides of the churning clouds above. She fumbled for the key to her fortress-grade padlock, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip the tiny piece of brass. It slipped from her trembling fingers, bounced once on the concrete, and then, with that sickening little tink, vanished down the storm drain. We all just stared at that drain. It was the perfect, almost slapstick unit of cosmic irony. She had been so determined to protect us from the phantom menace of teenage loitering that she had inadvertently locked us all out in the face of a very real, very lethal threat. Panic began to bubble to the surface. People started pulling uselessly at the heavy steel door. Gus arrived, his face grim, and gave it a mighty heave, his muscles straining. The door groaned in protest, but didn't budge. The roar of the approaching tornado was getting louder, a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated in our chests. The Hendersons' youngest child, a little boy who couldn't have been more than 5, started to cry, his small body shaking with sobs. The fear was palpable, thick in the air like the humidity before a downpour. People looked around wildly, desperately, as if another shelter might magically materialize out of the rapidly deteriorating sky. My eyes darted around, a desperate inventory of our surroundings. My house. It was maybe 50 yards away. My second-story office window. And then, a flash of bright, obnoxious safety yellow filled my mind's eye. A quarter-ton of high-grade FAA-certified nylon. A CO2 canister powerful enough to launch a Fiat. My God, the slide. I turned to Gus, a wild, half-crazed grin spreading across my face. "Gus, I have a terrible, brilliant idea. My house, now!" He stared at me, his usual stoic expression momentarily replaced by utter bewilderment. "For what? Your collection of antique sporks?" "The slide, Gus! The giant airplane slide! The bewilderment on his face slowly morphed into dawning comprehension. Then a look of horrified disbelief. And finally, a flicker of something akin to, "What the hell, we're all gonna die anyway," resolve. I yelled to the huddled, terrified group, "Stay here! Don't go anywhere! I'll be right back!" And then, adrenaline surging through me, I took off in a dead sprint towards my house, Gus pounding along beside me, both of us fighting against the increasingly violent wind. We burst into my garage, the air thick with the musty smell of cardboard and forgotten sporting equipment. The enormous yellow bag lay in the center of the floor, mocking my earlier dismissal. We grabbed opposite ends, the weight of it surprisingly significant, and began the awkward, clumsy ascent up the stairs. It was like trying to carry a very uncooperative, overstuffed duffel bag the size of a small pony. We bumped against walls, knocked over a floor lamp in the hallway with a crash, and stumbled our way into my second-floor office, panting and out of breath. I threw open the window. A ferocious gust of wind ripped into the room, scattering papers from my desk like confetti in a hurricane. Below, we could see the terrified huddle of our neighbors, their faces pale and upturned. This is it, I thought, my heart hammering against my ribs. The point of no return. The moment when a stupid, drunken purchase transcends its own stupidity and becomes something else. Legend. Or a very expensive, very yellow funeral. We wrestled the unwieldy bag over to the window. Stenciled in faded black letters on its side were the instructions. 1. Attach girt bar to floor brackets. 2. Pull inflation handle. I stared at the words. Floor brackets? I said to Gus, my voice laced with a fresh wave of panic. My house doesn't have floor brackets for a 737 evacuation slide. Gus, ever the pragmatist in the face of escalating absurdity, scanned the room. His gaze landed on my ridiculously heavy, solid oak desk. With a grunt that spoke volumes, he shoved it against the wall directly beneath the window. "That ain't going nowhere," he declared, his jaw set. "Tie it to the legs." We frantically fumbled with the thick nylon straps that were somehow supposed to attach this thing to an airplane floor. We looped them around the heavy desk legs, cinching them as tight as we could. It felt woefully inadequate, like trying to moor a cruise ship to a rowboat, but it was the best we had. With another grunt, we managed to shove the bundled slide out the window. It hung there precariously, a giant, limp sausage of bright yellow fabric swaying in the wind, a starkly surreal contrast to the raging green sky. I frantically searched the outside of the bag for the inflation handle. There it was, a bright red T-shaped handle with the word "pull" emblazoned in bold white letters. I took a deep breath, the roar of the approaching tornado now deafening. "You sure about this?" Gus asked, his voice surprisingly calm considering the circumstances. "Absolutely not," I replied, my voice trembling slightly. "Pulling it?" I gripped the handle, said a silent prayer to whatever deity watches over impulsive internet shoppers, and yanked. For a split second, nothing happened. The wind howled, the house rattled, and I thought, "Oh, great, I bought a defective emergency slide. Just my luck." Then, with a deafening "Heists," the CO2 canister activated. The slide exploded out of its bag with an astonishing force. It uncoiled with incredible speed, a massive, bright yellow serpent unfurling in the stormy green air. The sound was like a jet engine firing up in my office. In what felt like mere seconds, the 25-foot-long slide fully inflated, bouncing once with a soft thud on the waterlogged lawn before settling at a perfect, inviting angle, its base a mere few feet from the jammed tornado shelter door. The crowd below stood in stunned, silent awe. The crying stopped. Even the wind seemed to momentarily hold its breath, as if even nature was taken aback by the sheer audacity of the situation. I leaned out the window, yelling over the diminishing roar of the inflation. "It works! Send the kids first!" The Henderson dad didn't hesitate. He scooped up his terrified 5-year-old son, carried him through my front door, which I'd thankfully left ajar in my panicked rush, and up the stairs. The boy, who had been sobbing just moments before, now had a look of wide-eyed wonder on his face. He reached my office window. I gave him an encouraging thumbs up, and then, with a whoop of unexpected joy, he went wee all the way down the bright yellow chute, landing safely in his mother's waiting arms. His older sister followed, her earlier fear replaced by peals of laughter. One by one, our neighbors, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning relief, scrambled into my house, ran up the stairs, and took the most surreal and unconventional route to safety imaginable. Mr. Gable, his usual grumpy demeanor replaced by a look of something suspiciously close to amusement, slid down with surprising agility, clutching his dentures in one hand. Sarah, the grad student who always had her nose in a book, tucked her laptop securely under her arm, and slid down with the practiced ease of someone who'd clearly envisioned this scenario in a particularly vivid dream. Brenda was last. She stood at the base of the slide, her face a mask of utter horror. She watched as her carefully constructed world of rules and regulations dissolved with each neighbor who gleefully, or grudgingly, embraced this flagrant violation of every conceivable bylaw. "Brenda!" I yelled from the window, the wind picking up again, the roar of the tornado growing louder. "Your turn! The tornado is not going to wait for a committee vote!" Gus, who had already slid down with a surprising lack of fanfare, yelled up at her. "Get on the slide, lady, unless you've got a better plan involving that useless chain." The roar was deafening now. Through the swirling debris, I could see the ominous funnel cloud looming at the edge of our subdivision, with a strangled cry of despair at the complete and utter breakdown of order. Brenda finally relented. She trudged into my house, her posture stiff with indignation, climbed the stairs as if she were facing a firing squad, reached my office window, clutched her clipboard to her chest like a shield against the indignity of it all, and slid down with a terrified, rigid posture, landing with an unceremonious oof at the bottom. Gus and I were the last ones. We exchanged a look of exhausted disbelief, then clambered onto the top of the slide. The wind howled around us as we shot down the bright yellow incline, landing in a slightly less than graceful heap just as the full force of the tornado's outer bands hit. We scrambled the last few feet and huddled together with our neighbors against the relatively sheltered side of the concrete bunker, shielded from the worst of the flying debris. We were huddled behind the tornado shelter, not safely inside it, but we were alive. And for that brief, glorious, utterly insane moment, my stupid, expensive, utterly useless airplane slide was the single most important object in the entire damn universe. Best $150 I ever spent. The roaring subsided, replaced by an eerie, almost unsettling calm and the sound of water dripping from unseen sources. The world outside was a chaotic mess of shredded leaves, broken branches, and scattered debris. A few houses had clearly suffered roof damage, and one unlucky soul down the street had lost a significant portion of their garage. But miraculously, the main funnel had skirted just to the north of Pleasant Meadows Estates. Everyone was shaken, covered in leaves and dirt, but undeniably alive. A strange mix of relief and exhilaration hung in the air. The neighbors, who had previously only exchanged polite nods during sidewalk encounters, were now looking at me with a newfound respect, bordering on bewildered gratitude. Mr. Henderson clapped me on the back, his face beaming. Even Mr. Gable managed a grunt that sounded suspiciously like approval. And then there was the slide. It remained there, in all its ridiculously bright yellow glory, a 25-foot testament to impulsive online shopping and last-minute ingenuity, stretching from my second-story window to the now waterlogged lawn. It was the most surreal and undeniably attention-grabbing piece of lawn art in the history of suburban landscaping. Just as the initial shock began to wear off, 2 police cars, lights flashing but sirens silent, rolled slowly into the devastated tranquility of Pleasant Meadows Drive. Officer Miller, a veteran who looked like he'd seen it all and then some, and his young, earnest partner, Officer Davis, emerged from their vehicles, taking in the scene with expressions of stunned disbelief. Miller stopped, slowly took off his sunglasses, and rubbed his eyes as if trying to dislodge a particularly vivid hallucination. Davis simply stood there, his mouth slightly agape, his gaze fixed on the improbable yellow chute snaking down the side of my house. "Okay, rookie," Miller said to Davis, his voice low and weary. "You're going to see a lot of weird things in this job. Just file this one near the top." Brenda, ever the opportunist, saw her chance to reclaim some semblance of authority amidst the chaos. She straightened her wind-blown perm, smoothed down her rumpled jacket, and marched purposefully towards the officers, her expression a mask of righteous indignation. "Officers! Thank goodness you're here," she announced, her voice shrill. "I want to report a reckless endangerment and gross violation of municipal codes." This man, she pointed a dramatic finger in my direction, deployed an uncertified, unlicensed, inflatable device. He endangered us all. Before I could even begin to formulate a defense, Mr. Gable stepped forward, his normally stooped posture surprisingly erect. Then Mrs. Henderson, then Sarah, still clutching her slightly damp laptop. A chorus of voices erupted, everyone talking at once, recounting Brenda's frantic attempts to secure the shelter, the jammed door, the lost key, and the undeniably life-saving role of my ridiculously oversized escape slide. Officer Miller, his expression unreadable, ambled over to the tornado shelter. He examined the heavy chain, the mangled shackle of Brenda's padlock, a testament to Gus's brief but furious attempt at forced entry, and the storm drain where the key had met its watery demise. He looked from Brenda to me, then back to the improbable yellow slide. A slow, tired smile began to spread across his face. "Ma'am," he said to Brenda, his voice calm but with a distinct edge. "From where I'm standing, it looks like the only person who endangered anyone was the one with the padlock. You're lucky this man had whatever the hell that thing is. Now, I suggest you go home and maybe read up on the statutes regarding obstruction and reckless endangerment yourself." He turned to me, shaking his head slightly, a genuine chuckle escaping his lips. "Son, I don't even know what citation I'd write for this. Improper deployment of an aircraft egress system? I'm just going to pretend I didn't see it. You might want to deflate it before the FAA shows up, though." With a final, weary glance at the scene, Miller and Davis got back into their patrol car, both shaking their heads in silent disbelief as they drove slowly out of Pleasant Meadows Estates. The immediate threat of legal repercussions had vanished, replaced by a growing sense of legendary status, at least amongst my neighbors. The following week, the Pleasant Meadows Estates Community Clubhouse was packed for an emergency HOA meeting. The air was thick with unspoken tension and the lingering scent of damp drywall. Brenda, looking pale and determined, stood at the podium clutching a thick sheaf of papers, presumably a meticulously documented account of my numerous transgressions. She was ready to deliver her version of events, one that undoubtedly cast me as a rogue element who had recklessly jeopardized the safety and aesthetic harmony of our suburban paradise. She began her speech, her voice trembling slightly, but regaining its familiar tone of authority with each carefully chosen word. "Regarding the unfortunate events of last Tuesday," she began, adjusting her reading glasses, "a thorough review of our bylaws has clearly shown that Mr. Henderson's impulsive and frankly bizarre actions—" She was cut off mid-sentence. Mr. Gable, surprisingly, was the one who interrupted. He stood up slowly, his normally hunched posture almost regal. "Brenda," he said, his voice surprisingly firm, silencing the entire room. "Shut up!" A collective gasp rippled through the assembled residents. Brenda blinked, her mouth agape. Mr. Gable, the man who usually communicated through grunts and muttered complaints about leaf blowers, had just told the HOA president to be quiet. The world had officially tilted on its axis. Then Mr. Henderson, a quiet, unassuming man who rarely spoke at meetings, stood up. "We're invoking Article 12 of the HOA Charter," he announced, his voice surprisingly steady. "A vote of no confidence." A wave of murmured agreement spread through the room. One by one, the people who had slid down my emergency evacuation device recounted the story of the jammed shelter door, the lost key, and the sheer, undeniable fact that my ridiculous purchase had likely saved them from serious injury, if not worse. They spoke of Brenda's obsession with rules over common sense, her inability to adapt in a genuine crisis. They praised my quick thinking, my willingness to embrace the absurd in the face of danger. Brenda stood at the podium, her carefully prepared speech clutched uselessly in her hand, her face a mask of stunned disbelief. Her power, so carefully cultivated and fiercely guarded, built on the shaky foundation of petty rules and regulations, crumbled in the face of a shared, life-altering experience. The vote was swift and nearly unanimous. Brenda Wexler, the self-proclaimed queen of Pleasant Meadows Estates, was officially removed as HOA president. The silence that followed the announcement was thick with a mixture of relief and a dawning sense of liberation. I sat on my newly finished deck 2 weeks later, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the meticulously stained wood. Gus had just packed up his tools, the job finally complete. The deck was perfect, exactly as I'd envisioned it, a peaceful oasis overlooking my slightly overgrown but now gnome hat-tolerant backyard. The infamous yellow slide was deflated and neatly packed away in its enormous bag in the garage, a silent, slightly absurd monument to a day the neighborhood would never forget. The local news had run a surprisingly straight-faced segment on the suburban evacuation miracle, complete with shaky cell phone footage of neighbors sliding down the side of my house. I'd even become something of a minor local celebrity, the guy with the crazy airplane slide. As Gus prepared to leave, he gestured towards one of the deck railings. I got up and walked over to it. Affixed to the cedar was a small, rectangular bronze plaque. I leaned in to read the inscription, "The Alex Henderson Memorial Egress. In case of Karen, pull handle." I chuckled, shaking my head. "You're a real comedian, Gus." He allowed a rare, small smile to flicker across his weathered face. "Just figured the place needed a story. Gotta go. Got a job installing a panic room for some lady across town. Says her neighbors are anarchists." He climbed into his truck and rumbled away. I stood there for a moment, looking out over Pleasant Meadows Estates. It felt different, lighter. The air seemed less thick with unspoken anxieties about lawn maintenance and decorative shrubbery. People waved more readily. I even noticed Mr. Gable had a new garden gnome, perched right on his property line, sporting a hat that could only be described as aggressively pointy. So yeah, I own a piece of aviation history that I used exactly once to evacuate my neighbors from my second-story window, because our HOA president had a monumental power trip at the absolute worst possible moment. My deck is finally done. Brenda is in social exile, though I did receive a very formal 6-page letter outlining the numerous structural deficiencies of my unauthorized emergency egress system. And I'm pretty sure the Henderson kids think I'm some kind of suburban superhero who moonlights as a graphic designer. All in all, it was a weird-as-hell Tuesday. But I'll tell you one thing, I'm still keeping a close eye on those government auction websites. You never know when you might need a surplus submarine periscope. For neighborhood watch purposes, of course.